Excellencies, dear colleagues, welcome to the second day and fourth session of the Geneva Toxic Free Talks. This event is organized in hybrid mode with attendees with us in Geneva at the Centre Administratif de la Vendée and a few others online. As mentioned yesterday, every fall we are delighted to welcome the Special Rapporteur on Toxics and Human Rights to Geneva as he reports to the Council on issues related to his mandate. We take this opportunity to organize the Geneva Toxic Free Talks on the sidelines of the Human Rights Council. This is the good moment in the year to harness the opportunity to reflect on the challenges posed by the production, use, and dissemination of toxics, and on how Geneva contributes to bringing together the actors working in reversing the toxic tide. This year, Geneva Toxic Free Talks take place over 2 days with conferences and discussions celebrating an important milestone, the 25 years of the mandate and the struggle for the right to live in a toxic-free environment. Today's dialogues will look at repairing toxic damages, and the first, which is taking place now, will discuss getting rid of toxics, the non-polluting alternatives. Before I give the floor to the moderator, Yves Lador, the Geneva representative of Earth Justice and co-organizer of these talks, let me remind for those who are online with us that you can raise your questions by using the Q&A box, which we will address in the discussion session of this event. The summary and the video of this event will be available online as usual on the link that has been shared by my colleagues. Yves, over to you.
Thank you very much, Diana. And so welcome to everybody, those who are with us, who have just joined, and those who are online. And those who are also who will look at us on replay, because we know that this is one of the very high points of the Geneva Environmental Network, that a number of these events are reviewed afterwards by a number of people throughout the world. So welcome to all of you for this second day. And as it was said, in the frame, we really celebrated yesterday the 25 years of the mandate with a number of very interesting issues and questions, and also new perspectives for what will come next for the mandate and for this challenge to reverse the toxic tide which is threatening us. Today, we are going to focus on exploring new issues in a way. Well, they're not totally new for the mandate, but they definitely need more thoughts and probably to enlarge the constituencies who are working around the mandate, and because they definitely are very important questions to deal with today. So we are going to have today 2 dialogues to explore these issues, and we'll start with the first dialogue on non-polluting alternatives. One of the issues that came out actually yesterday in the discussion is that very often when we try to solve a problem, we don't really solve it, we change it, we move it. So we move it to another issue. And that's how very often when we're trying to find alternatives, we create other types of pollution. One of the issues we'll start with, and we will have 2 examples today. And the very first we'll start with concerns medical operation. We know that medical activities and medical operation are an important provider of toxic substances and toxic wastes. But within that, there is a specific issue for those who are doing emergency work in the field. Because of course they are outside of the usual structures where you can recycle and so on. And even though this remains an issue in itself, once you're in the field, you also contribute to disseminating a number of things. We have the pleasure to have with us Médecins Sans Frontières Suisse, Doctors Without Borders Switzerland, who actually very aware of this issue, has started to see how can they improve their operation in the field and how can they find precisely some non-polluting alternatives. Guillaume Schmitz, thank you very much for being with us. You are the pharmacist of the Swiss section, and you have in MSF developed a new project to try to see how you can handle that, and in particular, but you'll tell us about that, the dissemination of plastics through your activities, which is of course totally involuntary, and you're trying to tackle with this. So please tell us your experience, give us your thoughts. This is a very interesting experience on which we'd like to give more attention. The floor is yours, and thank you for being with us, Guillaume.
Yes, thanks for you too, and thanks to allow me to discuss and present a little bit on what we are doing regarding this field of plastic contaminations. That is, you know already, it's really a global, worldwide problems. We are really surrounded with a lot of plastics, and as a humanitarian organization, Doctors Without Borders or Médecins Sans Frontières, since few months we are trying to look at this, because before, just to set the context, MSF is working in more or less 70 countries and with specialized in emergency humanitarian organizations and humanitarian activities. And so all those activities, health activities, were before developed at any cost for the planet. And we are treating millions of patients, and in hospitals, health centers, refugees camps. We are also delivering medicines to patients that are external patients that are taken medicines in the treatment center, and where they are provided with those prescribed medicines that can be under the forms of blisters with aluminum plastic that generates an enormous waste, but also for medicines in big containers. It can be 500 or 1,000. We are providing those treatments to external consultants in plastic bags with a pictogram with the moon and the sun to explain clearly the way to take the medicine, the posology, in different cultures and contexts where it should be clearly defined to be sure that the patient will respect the treatment according to prescription. Then you can imagine those mothers coming for their own treatment, and also kids with, for example, malaria problems. They are going back home with these ambulatory treatments into those plastic bags at home. And when the treatment is over, they simply get rid of those plastic bags in their home environment, or even more, they are using as a combustible to burn them and to aliment when they are cooking rice. It's a good combustible. The mothers like it, and so they are being totally intoxicated by those plastic fumes. So we are generating this kind of plastic waste really involuntarily. Today it's amazing how we see those plastic contamination as a visual contamination, but not yet really aware about what are the risks of physical contamination and biological effect of those plastics around the home when they start to degrade and become micro and then nanoplastics. And at this stage, it's where all the contamination comes for the animals, for the humans, for the soils, for the water. And we have really we decided in MSF to start thinking about it and to see how we can change our way to be more planetary friendly related to our humanitarian activities, to try also to find alternative to these dispensing bags. So we started with these little bags, this little item, because it is a bring back home, so that's because of this direct home contamination, and also to see if we can expand at the end this kind of possibilities, alternatives that we may find on the market to apply it to other numbers of plastic items that we are using. And as usual, as like in our home environment, we are really using and surrounded by a lot of plastics. So since a bit less than 1 year, we decided to open this project. Also trying to find an alternative to those dispensing bags made with a bio-sourced and biodegradable product. On those two essential criteria, we have considered that the bio-sourced material should be as much as possible not linked with nutritional plants that may interfere with the capacity to aliment properly the population, especially in those times with climate change and disturbances, international disturbances that may deprive people from correct food. So we try to find non-alimentary biosourced sources. And also we, in this project, we decided to focus on these plastic bags, but also on the African continent, because it is where we are working as MSF, but also because we have seen that today a lot of African countries are trying to ban plastics from their market and to substitute it to mainly paper bags, or because the really suitable alternative does not exist yet. There is no ready to use solution today. Then also we decided to launch in Africa because personally, I have been requested by a Ministry of Health, a pharmacy department of an African country, that's saying, but MSF, why at the time we are trying to ban those plastics, why are you still importing those dispensing plastic bags? So it was really an interesting question and challenging our practices. And also, in a more general mood, we try today to commit to a more planet-friendly humanitarian operations. And we have to move on all the side effects of our actions that we may create without being really conscious about the extent of the problem and the potential toxicity we generate on population. So that's why we decided to start and to screen in Africa with this little that looks a little item, but in fact it's a start. We have to start with something and to demonstrate the feasibility of this project. So since 10 months today, we are working in association with one of our supply center based in Kampala, Uganda, and where we have recruited a bioeconomist that is based there, and we partner with this bioeconomist. And the first thing was to screen all the African startups and companies that are working in this field. So we went a bit further, also other countries we have identified like India, Indonesia, Mexico, but we try to focus, to try to make a possible manufacturing capacity at the place where we intervene. Today, we have in the strategy that we launched, we started to design tools to validate, identify, analyze both the alternative biomaterials and also the companies that are existing, and to be in order to select what will be the best product in best time to be able to shift to those better planet-friendly alternatives. So in this strategy, we have made a move because, as I said before, we started on a biosourced and biodegradable product, but we quickly saw that the concept of biodegradability indeed is hiding a lot of sub components that may be perverse or have a perverse impact. For example, we can see in the market today those biodegradable plastics that are simply chemically modified plastics that will accelerate the degradation of the plastic into micro and nanoplastic. And so in going to those biodegradable alternatives, we are worsening the problem and speeding up the contamination, potential contamination of waters, humans and animals. So we shift then to this from this biodegradable concept to a home compostable capacity alternative, and that is where today we are focusing on. So we already we are in contact with around 20 companies. We have on nearly 80 companies identified. We are looking and analyzing something like 15 mixture, because that is part of the technical challenges we face. I will come back on it, and trying to advance with those companies. And we already started to get samples with those really home compostable and biosourced plastic bags. Now we are facing some challenges because, for example, those dispensing bags are supposed to be to maintain the full integrity of the medicines during a temporary storage system, let's say for 7 days, and it should be totally waterproof. We should have a really complete and efficient closure system. And it should be sufficiently robust. We have to also design the pictogram for the posology with bioinks. So today we see that also producers are telling us that we came at the right time because the technology is there. We have solutions now, but not the last final solution that will be really suitable. That is part of the challenges. For example, the closure system is a problem to protect the medicines because it's difficult for most of the companies to produce a home compostable closure system. Today, it's a plastic zip closure system. And to produce a bio-zip, it's still again an issue. So we try to find also any kind of efficient alternative closure system. So some of other challenges we are facing is that today those mixtures that are used and proposed by those companies may contain some industrial secrets. Also contain supplements, additives, for example, compatibilizers or other kind of additives that may generate toxicity during degradation. Those industrial secrets we try to keep it, to get it, to be sure that we will not start with a product that at the end will also generate its own toxicity because of associated product. So this challenge to have the full biosourced and home compostable criteria efficient on this project are still under discussion and are still a challenge. We are going to test the samples we have, a test in parallel with all the international certifications and can provide us those companies, but also to test the real degradability or home compostability in MSF setup. For example, we would like to test those bags in a country, Saharan country, in a very dry and hot climate, but as well in a very humid climate countries like in Southeast Asia or some other African countries with very humid climates, because the characteristic of the degradation may be different in those contexts. So we even try to see if we can have an alternative component that can be eatable, not by humans maybe, but not going too far, but by animals without any toxicity, but at least to also sponsor in this home compostability criteria to try to sponsor villages composting system where we tomorrow we can put all those alternatives to plastics to degrade and to be able to feed at the end the ground for cultures or whatever. A challenge will be also we will introduce those first samples we got to in the real context and to have feedbacks from patients, but to have feedbacks from dispensers also in terms of practicability of those bags, efficiency, robustness, etc. And after we will see, it will be another challenge also to see the way we will introduce these new materials into markets, countries where we may be wrong or we don't know because and I think we will do this in partnership with national authorities of selected countries that are willing to work together with us on this introduction and having a visibility on what happened when we introduce those bags today. For sure, for the perspective, this bioplastic market is a market to come. We and all the producers we are in contact with are saying that also to us that the quickest solutions may not be the best solution. So we may go for a two-step strategy, trying to at the end find the best, the really product we need to find. And then starting for those little dispensing bags, we can imagine full of other applications. For example, can be MSF is doing large vaccination campaigns and vaccinating hundreds of thousands of kids, and we have plastic boxes that are collecting used syringes, needles, and we burn often in substandard temperature conditions that continue to pollute the atmosphere. So I will stop this here. We are willing to continue also to attract, because not only for the MSF sector, to attract other partners. There are a lot of international organizations that are using also those plastic dispensing bags, and we need to generate a sufficient volume and market volume to ensure an industrial sustainability. So for this, the purpose is really to share the outcomes after testing that we will reach, and with partner associations or organizations that may also be a part of this big pot of supplier volume request, but also all further discussions regarding, for example, intellectual property rights that will come sooner or later on the table. So that's it. It's a very, for us, new, for MSF, a new and exciting opportunity to take some time on it and to try to succeed on this. And even if we may not have the good product in a first shot, it can be a two-shot strategy, and we really want also to ensure that we will guarantee a sort of eco-kindness, and it goes also really to the direction of Doctors Without Borders to be more planet-friendly and to incorporate planet-friendly activities into our operations. Thanks to you.
Well, thank you to you, Guillaume. This was really a fascinating description of your experience, and congratulations for starting this. There's a number of issues actually which directly echo what we've been hearing yesterday, and some of the challenges that we identified yesterday. First of all, it's quite interesting that you mentioned as one of the starting trigger the fact that you were questioned by one of the ministry in an African country, and that's quite an interesting sign, because a number of us participate in the international negotiations, but it's quite interesting to see that these type of efforts also have a national effect, and that these countries are pushing these kind of issues at the national level. And actually, the African countries are behind the creation of the mandate of the special rapporteur. So it does say a lot. And I know that within the humanitarian sector, there's a number of efforts which are done by a number of organizations to try to deal with the environmental aspects of their own operation. Another element which I think I find really fascinating is one of the problems we have when we're dealing with these pollutions is you have the dispersed sources of pollution and the more concentrated sources of pollution. So in a few moments, we'll get to a more concentrated, the approach to more concentrated sources of pollution. But the dispersed is also a very, very difficult one to work on. And I think this is quite interesting to see what is needed in order to try to meet these type of challenges. And let me turn now to the special rapporteur to see if Marcos or Elena would have some comments on this. In the field of human rights, one of the very big issues that is we insist all the time is the best appropriate technology to be applied. Very often we don't think of this type of approach. At least states or in the negotiation, these type of approaches are not included the way we think about best appropriate technologies. So I was wondering, what is your views, or how do you feel about it when you heard this experience? Marcos?
Thank you very much, Yves. It's once again a pleasure to be with you all here today. I want to once again thank the Geneva Environment Network and Earth Justice for putting together the Geneva Toxic Free Talks. And Yves, I want to echo your statements of congratulations to Guillaume Schmidt for their innovation, their work, their vision in dealing with the actual problems that they have identified in the field as to their operations. So I'm happy to share a couple of reactions and comments, and perhaps also squeeze a question in there. The mandate on toxics and human rights, as many in in the stream may be familiar, is a monitoring and reporting mandate. And so in its analysis of situations, the main thrust is to document human rights issues, abuses, and violations, to offer recommendations as well. And so in dealing with a problem, being able to see it in a 360-degree lens, as it were, that brings the questions of solutions. If a couple examples in the report on mercury and artisanal and small-scale gold mining that I presented to the council on Tuesday, it includes analysis of possible mercury-free technologies. And it makes the point that these technologies are actually more efficient than those using mercury in getting the gold out from the ore. Now, they do involve costs, and so that's where international cooperation comes into play, and the position in which MSF finds itself can also help in that direction. There are questions of incentives to implement technologies. Now, this has a much broader range of application, this debate, this issue. If we look at one aspect of it, decarbonization efforts. What are the chemical pollution impacts of that? That's of course huge as we face the climate emergency. Another example, as talking about plastics in particular, in the report on plastics and human rights that I prepared last year, it includes a section on false solutions. So questions of, or some proposals on recycling or incineration, either misleading or outright false, disinformation. But Guillaume, you put on the table the issue of toxics in the materials. That report on plastics and human rights brings in the issue of toxics in bioplastics, for example, as a risk of a potentially false solution, in that it appears to be, but it can lead to further toxification. So one question is how to assess, in a life cycle approach, how can we assess all the implications of the material? So that's one question. Another question is on the mode of delivery. As far as I understood your presentation, Guillaume, the focus is to find a way for the materials of single-use delivery not to pose additional problems for toxics and otherwise. You've also mentioned not competing with plants that are nutritional plants, as are the words you used, which is, of course, a debate that a couple of years ago was very heavy on biofuels and other technologies that were competing with people's food. And so the question there is single use still the best frame to think about this? Are we replacing one mode of delivery that's problematic, plastics, for others that could be problematic on other grounds? Could we also consider or think about other modes of delivery that do not immediately convert themselves to waste, that could become part of the circular economy in that sense? So there's a question there. And a final reaction is that your work, well, of course, focused on the activities of MSF, may have implications for pharmacies worldwide. There are various modes of deliveries for medicines. There are very interesting programs to deal with already obsolete or expired medicines, but on the container side, it is not just that plastics are being used in MSF's operations, they're being used worldwide in respect of medicines. And so there may be lessons learned, and so the leadership that you're showing with this initiative may have that implication for a whole field, and even beyond, as we think about the ways in which these issues need to be addressed. So thanks again for the presentation. Congratulations, and yeah, very interested in any reactions you may have to those questions. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I'll turn to you, Guillaume, but just ask you to answer in a few sentences,
Yes.
because we'd like to go to the next speaker. And I know that you probably will have to leave. It's a very busy day for you. So once again, thank you for being with us. Feel free to, you're welcome to stay, but feel free to leave if you need to do so. But in a few sentences, if you want to react to the special rapporteur's comments.
Yes, and thank you for your reaction and questions, because it's really pertinent ones. For the how to not go into the trap of false solutions that may be even worse than plastic contamination and pollution. We are really strongly discussing with those companies that are producing those biomixtures to clearly get transparency on each of components participating to the composition of those mixtures, and also sourcing, and also regarding bringing a proof of eco-kindness. And that is also really, we try to challenge the companies to get in board with this, what can be partial solutions. Regarding single-use products, that is a very good question, because we are also considering this for a specific mask, gloves, for example. That is gloves. It's tons, and it's really a big issue in terms of waste management. To come back on this principle of single use, and that is a parallel project we started to develop, especially on gloves, and we also hope to come to something that we can propose to the community, and how, yes, to shift to this kind of mode. And you're right that for your last point, you know, we are doing this, but when we are seeing those this multi-billionaire pharmaceutical industry also dropping everywhere kind of blisters that are plastic, aluminium, little containers, and so we have made a meeting with a big Swiss pharmaceutical company, and to some point, and also to challenge them also to say, hey, we have to get rid of this kind of presentation blisters. You have to look at it, and you have to search for it. They have the financial capacity also to look for alternatives. And I think we have also to attract the pharmaceutical industry to be partner in this kind of activities, to see together how we can do better, and with finding all the capacities of resource to make it real. So thank you very much. Sorry to be a bit long.
No, it's fascinating. Thank you very much for your answers, and we look forward to staying in touch, to continuing this discussion. As I said, these dialogues are explorations we want to do, and I think it really showed how worthwhile it is. So we see this as being just a first step.
Yeah.
Thank you really very much, really. And let me turn now to our second speaker, who has been gently listening to this discussion from where he is in Australia. So Lee Bell, let me turn to you now. And actually, in what we heard, there was some very interesting address to some of the questions that we heard yesterday from your colleague from IPAN, the International Pollutant Elimination Network, Yuyun Isnawati, who highlighted how important was the issue of transforming false solutions, basically, where you want to transform a problem, and then you get exactly the description we had. Actually, you accelerate the creation of plastic nanoparticles with the wrong toxic solution. So You are, as the leading researcher within IPAN, you're one of the leaders on these issues, precisely on how can we have non-pollutant alternatives in order, for example, to get rid of dioxin, to take one example, which is a very, very long-lasting substance, a very toxic one, very dangerous. The usual thing is we hear is just, well, burn them, right? That's what we hear most of the time. And that's basically what we're doing. That's what you're opposed to. You're saying this is the wrong way to deal with it, and there are alternatives. We can not only we can do better, but we have to do better because these are false solutions. They are not destroying the toxins and just making sometimes the problem worse. So Lee, thank you for being with us, and we're looking forward to listening to your experience.
Thank you very much, and I do appreciate you inviting me to take part in this dialogue, and I thank also the special rapporteur for initiating this conversation, because it's one that needs to be had, and it's something that we very rarely get to speak of, even at the Conference of the Parties related to the chemical conventions. It's a very interesting topic, I think, because as you mentioned, we have been conditioned to accept technologies like incineration now for many decades, and there are a lot of problems associated with them. But just before I get to my presentation, I'll just briefly introduce IPEN, the International Pollutants Elimination Network. They formed early on around the Stockholm Convention work to do with persistent organic pollutants and to watchdog that process. As an organization, we're made up basically of networks of over 600 NGO groups in 120 countries. So what we tend to do is disseminate information on technical issues around hazardous wastes, not just POPs, but also mercury, heavy metals like lead, and so on. And we look towards detoxification of the planet and a toxic-free future for all. That's our objective. And in this presentation, I'll run through it relatively quickly, and I'll try not to be too technical. But what we're looking at is alternatives specifically to the destruction of persistent organic pollutants. The most hazardous chemicals is about 30 listed under the Stockholm Convention at the moment. They're the most hazardous chemicals on the planet. They're slated for complete elimination and bans on production, but also for destruction of stockpiles. And what I'll be talking about this afternoon is non-combustion technology, which is non-polluting technology for POPs waste destruction. And the interesting issue with it is it also has some other applications to some of the major pollution problems of our time. The way I like to look at it is the replacement of old technologies, old polluting technologies like an incineration, with clean technology. Next slide, please. Thank you. So we're talking about repairing toxic damages and a non-polluting approach. It doesn't get much worse than persistent organic pollutants. They exist as contaminated sites. They exist in certain emissions and as large stockpiles of old products like certain pesticides and industrial chemicals. Non-combustion technology is really designed to deal with very high-level concentrated toxic wastes and legacy chemicals, which need to be destroyed to detoxify the environment and to bring the chemical contamination issues back within the planetary assimilative boundaries. Some of you may be aware of recent publications that have scientific publications that have confirmed that we have passed the planetary's assimilative boundaries for chemical pollution. We need to start rolling back the contamination problem, and we need to deal with pollution issues from a production point as well, but we still have massive legacy issues to deal with. And unfortunately, burning waste in incinerators, cement kilns, and dumping in landfills just continues a polluting cycle, which I'll explain, and it's corrosive to human rights in many cases, and particularly for marginalized communities of low income or ethnic minorities, which tend to bear the burden of dealing with these facilities that destroy or attempt to destroy these wastes. So as I mentioned, we have contaminated site remediation to deal with, pesticide stockpiles, POP stockpiles, general hazardous waste treatment, chemical weapons neutralization, and even plastic waste. And the recent debate on plastic waste has shown that we're actually dealing with, in many cases, a form of toxic waste because of the toxic chemical additives in plastics. Next slide, please. So why should we use non-combustion technology to destroy POPs waste and other hazardous waste? Well, basically, non-combustion technologies are designed to destroy POPs waste without generating what's called unintentionally formed POPs, or UPOPs, which are dioxins and furans, but also a number of other POPs, including dioxin-like PCBs, and a variety of other chemicals as well. These tend to get formed in the combustion processes of incinerators and cement kilns. We hear a lot of claims that these technologies have overcome the problem of dioxin formation, but what's really happened over the last 30 or 40 years is that they've applied more and more filtration and scrubbing techniques to their smokestacks to capture dioxins and other UPOPs. And they call these BAT-BEP techniques, or best available technique, best environmental practice. And when you scrub and filter these materials out of the smokestack, you simply end up with more of the UPOPs in the residues, which are fly ash and bottom ash, or in the case of cement kilns, a material called cement kiln dust. And this contaminated ash becomes a pollution liability for decades to come. It is very difficult to manage, and once it's been created, it's very difficult to treat, to store, or to do anything with it. And it contains significant levels of POPs. Recent studies conducted by IPEN and other organizations have demonstrated that when you take this incinerator residue, these ashes, and it's about 30% by weight of all the waste that's burned. So if you put 1,000 tons of waste in an incinerator, you'll get around about 250 to 300 tons of ash that's polluted with dioxins. So it's a large amount of material globally, millions and millions of tons every year. And the studies have demonstrated that if you spread this type of ash on land, and this is a practice that takes place, they also use it in construction, and if it has a dioxin concentration above 0.05 parts per billion, which is very, very small, and that's within regulatory limits, that it can still contaminate the food chain to levels where produce such as eggs exceed the safe consumption limits. So our current regulatory system isn't protecting the population from the impacts that occur downstream of incineration and disposal of residues. Next slide, please. State-of-the-art incinerators still have dioxin impacts on the food chain, both from the emissions and the residues. They still haven't solved the emissions problem completely, and I won't go into the technical details as to why, but there are problems with it. And the little diagram you can see below shows egg sampling conducted around a state-of-the-art incinerator in the Netherlands. It's only been established for a few years. And what you can see in the red circles, if you like, or the red egg shapes, is eggs collected from free-range production in the vicinity of the incinerator that exceed the dioxin levels for human consumption. The eggs with the yellow colouring are borderline close to the dioxin consumption limit, and the green eggs are below the dioxin consumption limit. So we can see a very close relationship, and this was a study conducted by Toxico Watch in the Netherlands. They do great sampling work out there. It's showing here that basically that you have a fallout pattern around the incinerator for dioxin that's contaminating the local food chain. And if you want to look at more detail on how these processes occur and the types of sampling that are revealing this problem, there's an IPEN publication in conjunction with Arnica and NTN about toxic ash and how it poisons the food chain. That's available on the IPEN website. Next slide, please. So, as I mentioned, they have not solved the problems of dioxin with incinerators. There's a little diagram there that shows how much bottom ash is created, in this case from the incinerator in Harlingen in the Netherlands. They have a large quantity of bottom ash, a smaller quantity of fly ash, but it's very, very toxic because it's scrubbing those dioxins out to some degree, and other flue gas residues that are created during the scrubbing process. Those fly ash and flue gas residues have to be stored in underground salt mines to stop them transferring their toxicity to the environment, and they must be segregated from the environment for very long periods of time. Persistent organic pollutants are just that. They last in the environment for hundreds, if not thousands of years, particularly dioxin. And they're still, they're looking at sites that were making chloralkali in the 1800s in France. And the levels of dioxin in the soil around those old facilities are still extremely high, which means it's not breaking down at all. Next slide, please. So just a little diagram here to show that dioxin from incinerators in the form of ash contamination is often used in construction material, as road base, as paving aggregate, or mixed in with cement blocks. And eventually all of that material is demolished as buildings become old and roads are torn up. And basically we lose control of the dioxin in that material. It spreads throughout the environment, and then we see different creatures such as chickens that are in contact with the soil accumulate and concentrate that dioxin back into their eggs. It's also a problem with dairy industries. So cattle, beef, cheese, milk have all suffered from dioxin contamination scandals in the past for one reason or another, because dioxin and other POPs like to accumulate in fatty tissues. And that's how it comes about. Next slide, please. And just one point on, we did touch on plastics a moment ago, and the so-called new processes of chemical recycling and plastics that are treating it. The chemical recycling, or advanced recycling as it's called, proposed itself as an alternative to both incineration and mechanical recycling. It's mainly using pyrolysis and gasification technologies that have been around for decades. They have been classed as incineration in the EU and the US. And the problem is that they, from what we're hearing, the data that's emerging is that they generate low yields of useful material to put back into plastic manufacture, but they have an enormous hazardous waste stream and a very heavy carbon footprint. The technologies have had problems with dioxin formation for decades, and the lab performance can't be replicated at scale in the real world. And it was agreed in at the recent Basel COP not to include, or it wasn't agreed to include, chemical recycling in their technical guidelines, because there's many questions over whether it really constitutes environmentally sound management for plastic waste. And it's also recently been rejected by a global waste corporation as an unviable technology and largely a PR exercise. And I included it here because it does, in my view, fall into the category of incineration and has done for a very long time. Next slide, please. Just one point before I get on to discussing non-combustion technologies, and I will move through them quite quickly, and I'll only pick out a few highlights. I just wanted to raise the issue, which is very rarely discussed, which is environmental justice and human rights, which is an issue about distributive risk and the social implications of locating these polluting technologies. There have been many, many protests for many decades when new incinerators are proposed to be sited, because they tend to be sited in areas where you have people of low income, ethnic minorities, and people who don't have ability politically to fight the siting of these plants. The US EPA defines environmental justice as the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all peoples, regardless of race, skin color, national origin, and income, with respect to development, implementation, enforcement of laws, regulations, and environmental policies. And when that translates to citing unwanted land uses like incinerators, this is a critical issue. The policy remedy is environmental distributive justice, which is intended as a fair distribution of risks and benefits from polluting economic activities that all of society benefits from, but only a few people bear the imposed risk of. And what that often translates to is, in the rich neighborhoods, we don't see incinerators. In the poor neighborhoods, we see collections of incinerators and other land uses like that. Many cases around the world have been found and mapped of these types of harmful structures, unwanted land uses, and environmental hazards sited next to socially disadvantaged communities. We're experiencing this in Australia right now. We don't have an incineration industry. The industry is trying to establish itself here. There are dozens of proposals, and there are protests occurring right across the country in an attempt to prevent that from happening, because there are better alternatives. Next slide, please. Having laid out the issues with incineration, and particularly their problems of dioxin formation, and this applies to cement kilns as well, both combustion technologies, I'll briefly run through a number of highlights of non-combustion technologies. Gas phase chemical reduction, also known as hydrogen reduction, is one of the, I guess, Rolls-Royce operations of non-combustion. It operated in my hometown in Perth for 5 years, and it destroyed the entire stockpile of PCBs in our state. And it was so successful, they actually had to dismantle it and leave for projects in America and Japan, because there was nothing left to treat here at that point in time. They actually got rid of our entire stockpile. It uses hydrogen under higher temperatures to basically rip apart the molecules of toxic and hazardous wastes. And its outputs are largely methane and hydrogen, and the hydrogen can be recycled back into the process. It has spent several decades operating at commercial level around the world, destroying POP stockpiles. One of the issues is that they tend to only build them when there's a stockpile to destroy. They don't sit there on the shelf waiting for somebody to kind of rent or purchase it, because it's a substantial investment to establish them. But my understanding, I spoke to the technology developer recently, and they hope to have another facility up and running in Ontario in Canada in November at pilot scale this year, which is dedicated to destroying a difficult type of plastic called automotive shredder residue, which is full of brominated flame retardants, a very difficult waste to treat. Even incinerators have difficulty with it because of the bromine concentrations cause problems in their processes. So gas phase chemical reduction is an excellent technology that should be rolled out more comprehensively, and is a great alternative to incineration. No residues, no ashes, you simply end up with hydrogen and methane, which can be used for energy generation if necessary. Next slide, please. This is a look inside the reaction chamber of hydrogen reduction. You can see barrels of pure PCB waste, HCB waste, hexachlorobenzene. When the process finished and they're stacked inside this reaction chamber, the drums have no paint on them anymore. They're shiny steel, and there's nothing left inside them. The plastic's destroyed. The waste is destroyed. They even use their personal protective equipment that's contaminated, gets put inside, and that's destroyed as well. So it's a really comprehensive process. You will end up with the metals left over, that it doesn't destroy metals, but it does destroy organic hazardous waste. That's its target. Next slide, please. They have even configured this particular technology to process POPs contaminated soil. Establishment costs are around 50 million US, plus $1 million training and for training operators to oversee and supervise the operation. And that's around about 10% the cost of establishing a modern incinerator that has that pollution controls. So you can see economically it is a very good proposition. It's probably more expensive to treat the waste than an incinerator, but you have to remember that incinerators are subsidized by municipal waste burning on a large scale, and often by public subsidies, and sometimes by a fairly egregious form of renewable energy subsidies as well, as incinerators sometimes claim they produce renewable energy because of the biogenic fraction of what they burn. I won't go into that, but needless to say, it's another false solution. Next slide, please. Moving on, base catalyzed decomposition. And I should just say, please don't get worried at skipping through these slides, because there's a publication at the end of my presentation that includes all of this material and more, and you're welcome to download that for details. But just to let you know that BCD has been successfully operated in Mexico, Australia, the Czech Republic, where it destroyed a vast amount of dioxins in contaminated soils, and it's also been used on US Superfund remediation treatment of dioxins, PCBs, and pesticides, as well as elsewhere. Next slide, please. Thank you. Another technology that's emerging is ball milling or mechanochemical destruction. What you have in that slide is a picture of a cutaway of the inside of the reaction chamber, where you have a spinning shaft, steel balls, and the contaminated waste. And the spinning motion activates the balls. It shakes and operates and collides the balls at a very high frequency. Certain non-toxic chemical reagents are added, and the combination of this vibrating effect and the reagents that are added destroys the POPs within the process, and you end up with clean soil at the end of it if you're treating contaminated soil. There is an unusual feature in terms of how ball milling works, in that when it starts, it actually generates relatively high levels of dioxin inside, and they peak, and then it drops away, and they come back down to extremely low levels. And the mechanism is still being studied as to why that happens. But in the end, the process does destroy that material. There are no emissions, there are no residues from the process. Next slide, please. This is a large-scale trial of ball milling at the Bien Hoa site in Vietnam. This used to be a US Air Force base where vast stockpiles of Agent Orange were kept during the war. There was large-scale leakage of the Agent Orange, which is contaminated with dioxin, and so you ended up with large-scale soil contamination at the site. And people live on that site now. It's no longer an Air Force base, it's a residential area, and they have chickens, and other testing by IPEN has shown the chicken eggs there have phenomenally high levels of dioxin in them, but there's not much in terms of alternative food supply for local people. In any event, the ball milling process, which you can see behind the forklift, there's a ladder and two small batch reactors there. They processed the dioxin and destroyed both dioxin and dioxin-like PCBs to quite high levels. It can be destroyed to even higher levels by fine-tuning the process, but they were not able to within the time constraints of the project. Next slide, please. Another one that has been very successful is industrial supercritical water oxidation. It destroys POPs waste, chemical warfare agents, industrial hazardous wastes, and a range of other types of wastes. The US Defense Force has been trialing and developing it for their chemical weapons destruction program. And it was also used to destroy the Syrian chemical weapons stockpile during prior to the conflict there. And it was operated out of a seagoing vessel. And they were able to destroy the chemical weapons at sea with this process. And it's basically putting water under heat and pressure at the point where it becomes supercritical. And this is before it becomes steam, but it's no longer water and it hasn't yet become steam. It's what they call a supercritical point in its pressurization. And in that state, it can destroy virtually all organic materials. Again, it does not have any significant emissions or residues from the process. Next slide, please. Interestingly, one company, General Atomics, have now modified this technology so that it's containerized, mobile, modular, and can be transported to difficult locations. One of the big problems with POP stockpiles, 5,000 tons of DDT, say, is that you have to move it to fixed technologies like incinerators. And there's a large amount of risk and expense and insurance costs involved in those types of operations. And often there may be no incinerator or cement kiln nearby, and you may need to ship it overseas for destruction. So the mobility and having modular features so that you can add more and more units for large stockpiles is very attractive. A study in 1998 found that these technologies at that time were 15% less expensive than incineration to establish, and were only about 10% of the running costs of incineration. So very reasonably priced for destruction of wastes. And these are being used at the moment in the US, as I mentioned before, for both hazardous wastes and for chemical weapons stockpiles and destroying POPs. Next slide, please. And this is one of my recent, I've come across it recently and thought it's a very interesting technology that uses the behavior of POPs against itself. As I mentioned before, dioxin and other POPs are what they call lipophilic. They're attracted to fats. They're also attracted to oils and to plastics, because plastics contain hydrocarbon oil residues. And NASA developed this technology, these spears. These long spears, these white spears you can see, they contain a solvent. And this technology is designed to remove PCBs and other POPs like dioxin from sediment in riparian zones, estuaries, near beaches and so on, in riverbeds. And the reason that's important is because the traditional method is to dredge. And all that does when you dredge contaminated PCBs or dioxins is to spread it and resuspend it in the water column, making it bioavailable to all the aquatic life. And suddenly all of the levels of PCB and dioxin in the fish and the mollusks all skyrocket because you've disturbed it and resuspended it. The difference with ecospheres is it's non-invasive in the sense it's not excavation. They push the spears into the sediment. The dioxins are naturally attracted to the plastic. And then once they accumulate on the plastic surface, they're even more attracted to a special proprietary solvent inside the spears. So that the POPs waste is drawn inside the spears. And after a period of time, maybe 6 months, 18 months, whenever you've reached the cleanup target in the sediment, the spears are removed containing the POPs, and then they're destroyed in a system called a RIDS system. It's a dehalogenation system, both owned by the same company. And that particular system also does not have hazardous waste outputs or emissions. It's a non-combustion technology based on what they call alkali metal reduction. So it's a nice, what they call a treatment train. It's a two-step process. So you concentrate the POPs and then you destroy the POPs so that you're not dealing with vast amounts of contaminated sediment that need to be treated in terms of thousands of cubic tons. So again, a very interesting system. The same company is also developing a ultraviolet light system for destroying PFAS. I haven't gone into that here, but that's also looking quite promising. Next slide, please. So just I'm nearly finished, just to point out again that all of this material and much more is in our non-combustion technology report for POPs waste destruction. And it contains linkages to the requirements of the Stockholm Convention. It also goes into what they call low POPs content levels, which are the regulatory threshold for POPs waste, and speaks a lot about how it relates to that and what types of waste are required under law to be destroyed in these types of technology. Next slide, please. Just thank you for your attention and giving me the opportunity to speak to you about these different types of technologies that are established and others that are emerging. And just one final point I'd like to say is that I was very pleased to see that the Global Environment Facility, the GEF, has been funding some of these technologies to operate in different countries. We have a PCB destruction technology in the Philippines. The supercritical water technology is being applied to a project in Tajikistan to destroy a 5,000 ton stockpile of DDT. And I believe they funded some others as well. And Jeff also mentioned, just as an aside, in their projections for their priorities in the coming years, is also looking at, if you like, technologies for mercury treatment that can stabilize and remove them from the environment as well. So the GEF has been looking into non-combustion technology and funding projects with that. And we would certainly like to see a lot more of that. And we would also like to see in both cement kilns and incineration treated with a much more precautious approach for waste disposal, and to create a more economic level playing field for these types of non-combustion technologies, it would be important to see some sort of taxes applied that reflect the types of damage that those older combustion technologies are continuing to do to the planet and to the food chain. And I'll just leave you with one last thought, is that many of you will have, if you're in Geneva, will have seen the Swiss media coverage of the problem in Lausanne, with the old incinerator there has contaminated much of the city centre with dioxin, and there are bans on growing certain vegetables and raising chickens in the centre of the city as a result of the legacy dioxin from that situation. So even though they obeyed all the regulations and rules at the time, they've left a major legacy problem, and I'm sure we will reflect in decades to come on what modern incineration has left behind. Thank you very much.
Sorry about that.
Shall I start again?
Yeah.
No problem.
Okay, so we had a technical problem, so we'd like to apologize for that. Well, Lee, thanks a lot for your presentation, and sorry for the silence you had, and same thing for all of our listeners. You gave a very good example at the end, which was for us showing all the human rights challenge which is behind all your presentations, because there was so much easiness in going to combustion issues that we just forget about the problem. I mean, there's a bit of a sense, well, there's no really any alternatives. And that's exactly what we wanted to challenge here in this discussion, is that that's not true. And so there's here a lot to be overcome, so that we stop, in a way, spreading the idea or the feeling that, well, we're doing our best and we can't do any better. And that's where the human rights approach is particularly important, because if people are still, after you've treated all of that, on the basis of we're trying to improve the situation, but actually you're just concentrating and spreading the problem with dioxin to a level that actually will become unmanageable, because it goes everywhere. Through after reuse and construction, as you say, and so on. And there's so many projects which are actually labeled as being green projects, that we were having a huge issue there. So there is a human rights aspect to evaluate these technologies and to make sure that the end result is free from toxic. That's why we're talking about toxic-free planet and a toxic-free talk. So let me turn now, I would say, sorry about that, Marcus, back to you, as you were starting to raise perhaps some of the issues. As you were just saying, your mandate has been actually addressing these questions in different ways, even though, I mean, we had here a very, very complete overview of the different technologies available. What we have to, for us here in our discussion, have in mind is that we have problems with combustions, and there are a number of alternatives. Chemical alternatives and mechanical alternatives, which actually can lead us in a much better direction. So the floor is back to you, Marcus. And again, apologies.
Not to worry. Thank you very much, Yves. And thank you very much, Lee, for such an interesting presentation, looking at what are actual alternatives out there that can help us transition into a toxic free environment. Some of the comments I made earlier are relevant in this juncture today, right now, but I won't repeat them. But I do want to pick up on a couple points where the mandate, and not just my tenure, but for the duration of the mandate, 25 years plus, has been acting. For example, the issue of coal ash and fly ash and bottom ash and so forth. This was one of the first cases that the mandate, when it was created, took up. The case of the Chianti, I don't know if I'm pronouncing it right, that took more than 14,000 tons of coal ash from the city of Philadelphia in this vessel, trying to find a place to unload them. Then the people running the vessel dumped thousands of tons in Haiti. They dumped another amount at sea. Of course, this is an environmental crime, and it's part of the way the DNA of the mandate of the transfer of what are hazardous wastes from the north to the south. The mandate is no longer only about toxic waste, but we see that in its origin, these issues were already there and we're still there. And so one of the points that you made is that we have massive legacy issues and we haven't resolved them. And now we have new issues. So we're not in a good place. But the kind of technologies that you put on the table are very important. A couple more recent examples. On Tuesday, I presented my country visit reports to Mauritius and Italy. In Italy, I did visit an incinerator. I asked, could it destroy 100% of dioxins? And the technicians there kind of laughed at me and said, well, the technology doesn't exist for that. Well, but that's exactly the point, no? 99.9 maybe, 99.8, you know, we could debate the figures, but going to a point, Eve, that you put at the very beginning, that 0.1, if that's the amount, is extremely toxic. It's not that it's just a little bit and so we can live with it. These are some of the most dangerous substances known to human out there in the environment. And in Mauritius, going back to your point about funding from the Global Environmental Facility, one of the problems identified in that country visit was the lack of capacity to deal with medical waste and other waste. You know, there were several incinerators that were operating, but for various reasons, they were out of order, out of line, decommissioned, abandoned, condemned. They were no longer functional. There was only one working, not even at full capacity. This put a lot of strain on the only landfill in the country. This is a small island state. And one of the advice and answers of the United Nations Development Program that was providing and is providing support to Mauritius, very important support, has been to look into incineration alternatives. So in a way, we're back to kind of in time. Maybe there's a human fascination with fire for, you know, thousands of years, and there's an anthropological essay that needs to be written about this. But this takes me to the question that I have for you, which is, when you spoke about unintended POPs in the Stockholm Convention and the design of that convention resting on national action plans, including best available technologies, what are the obstacles that you see in understanding that best available technology can be a sufficiently flexible concept to encompass non-polluting toxic-free alternatives? Can we move there with the current design, or do we need a different design altogether?
Thank you for the question. I think that I don't think it's a problem so much with the way the convention is structured. I think the major part of the issue is that the incineration industry is so well established and has such a market share and is so heavily subsidized in so many ways that it's very difficult for competition to break through and have their waste treated in, so other technologies to have their waste treatment technologies rolled out in a larger commercial sense, because not only do the costs associated with incineration on a mass scale mean lower waste treatment costs for the waste generators, but at the same time, there's frankly a lot of political lobbying that goes on that ensures that the market share of incineration remains very, very high. And as we become much better at recycling in terms of individuals and on a community social scale, there's less and less material that is being sent to incinerators all of the time. It's declining, and they have to maintain their waste streams to maintain their capacities and maintain their profits. And so what we're seeing is strange movements in waste, such as large amounts of waste being sent from the UK to Scandinavian countries, so particularly Sweden, to burn in their incinerators, because Swedish people have become so good at recycling. So we've got these outdated technologies. We've got a massive oversupply of capacity within the industry. So there are too many incinerators operating to deal with the amount of waste that's around. And that means that they can offer very, very low rates to treat the waste. So it's difficult for other alternative technologies to break into the market. And one of the problems, particularly relating to the issue of best available technology, is the maintenance of, in particular technical guidelines, particularly in the Basel Convention, they maintain that incineration is the best available technology, and they have guidance documents that essentially become something like, the guidance documents end up not being, let's look at alternatives to technology, but how do we run a better incinerator? So it becomes like a car manual, how to turn this lever and tweak that knob and apply these different things to run the best possible incinerator. But they don't say what's the best way to deal with the waste. And so we've got this unusual situation in the POPs waste technical guidelines, where there's a table of all the different technologies that can destroy POPs. And about half of the table is full of non-combustion technology, and half of the table is full of cement kilns and incineration technologies. So we're giving mixed messages to the global community in terms of the guidance about what should really be adopted as best available technology. And what's not being said is that there are legacy issues associated with the combustion technologies. So they're all presented as being on a sort of even playing field in terms of their environmental impact, but that's just not the case. So you've got economic issues, political issues, and technical issues that combine to have combined in the past to thwart other alternative technologies from being widely adopted and commercialized, even though they're very successful at what they do.
Let me turn in the room to see if there's any questions, or also online if there's any questions from anybody. And if it's not the case, and it's mindful of the time, we are getting close to the end of our discussion. I was wondering, and turning back to the special rapporteur, wondering if you had any general comments after the two examples that we have just heard about. One on the more diffused way of spreading plastics throughout the nature involuntarily, and taking this on board, and here on elements which look to more concentrated sources of pollution, although what Lee has presented about soil reparation and this type of technology is something which is a bit in the middle, in the sense that it does touch also to a number of issues, like the one in Arica in Chile, which is a case you mentioned, I think, yesterday. And I was wondering, for example, if here we would see also a possibility to use this type of technologies to try to solve an issue which has been going on for too long. So anyway, this is the floor is back to you, Marcus, for some concluding remarks.
Well, thank you very much, Yves, and thanks to both speakers in our program today for raising and describing what are such important issues for the field. I thought I'd pick up on something that we just talked about, which is where are we today on the toxics and wastes cluster, the chemicals and waste cluster. And I want to pick up on something that Liebel put on the table about the legacy issues that we're facing. We're using technologies that today have a semblance, they appear to solve the problem, and yet they pose legacy issues that for many years to come, decades, if not centuries, will place risks on future generations. And at the same time, we have new chemicals, synthetic chemicals, chemicals that do not exist in nature. Several may mimic natural processes. The absorption or assimilative capacity of nature is unable to render them harmless. Some of them were a clear example, forever chemicals, PFAS or FAS sometimes. So we're faced with dilemmas. Technology innovation can be a promise, can offer opportunities, it can present problems as well. Now that's not a new issue, but at this time it appears that we do need to look at it squarely in the face, because for many years, chemical policy has been largely driven by a quest for innovation at any cost, in the underlying assumption that more innovation and more technology is good. And that is not always the case, as these situations demonstrate. And when it comes to the work of the mandate, these situations, again, are not abstractions. They concern individuals, groups, communities, peoples that are impacted in their enjoyment of fundamental rights by the harmful effects of chemicals and wastes. And so this rethinking of the relationship between technology, risk, innovation, hazard, should lead us to begin reconsidering existing default positions and underlying paradigms, and begin questioning whether our direction is the right one. I think that's rhetorical, because clearly the place we're at is not a good place, so we need to change direction. One element in that debate concerns essential uses. We're moving into a place where there's much debate as to whether some contamination, some chemical pollution may be acceptable because it is relating to uses that are essential. But essential for whom? Is it essential for industry to continue making money? Is it essential for society? And so what's essential for society? Is that agriculture? What's essential, and if I could argue in these terms, is clean water, clean air. That's what makes life possible. That's what makes healthy lives a life of dignity. And so contaminants do not have a place in that. We do need to move to a toxic-free environment and prevent the exposure. This is what we were talking about yesterday in the 25 years reflections of what have been some of the achievements of the mandate. So in terms of essential uses, there's a lot to be discussed. There's insights from this conversation about alternative technologies, non-polluting substitutes that are key to thinking about that horizon and that non-toxic free, the toxic-free environment. I want to thank once again the speakers. Thank you, Yves, for moderating. Thank you for giving me the floor. It's a real pleasure to be with you today.
Thank you, Marcus, for this really excellent concluding remarks for this dialogue. A very warm welcome also to you, Lee, for being with us. It's pretty late in Australia right now, so thank you for this, and thank you for your presentation and contributing to this discussion here in Geneva for the Geneva Toxic Free Talks. So we're now at the end of this dialogue, this first dialogue of today. We're going to have a half-an-hour break, and we'll have a second dialogue at 3:30 Geneva time, where we will be looking also at legacy issues, actually, but legacy coming from conflicts, older conflicts, and unfortunately ongoing conflicts. So please join us back here in the room or at the same address online at 3:30. And I'll turn now the floor back to Diana, and once again thanking her and her whole team for making these discussions and these dialogues possible.
Just to comment on what Yves just said, for who is on WebEx, it's a new link, and for who is online, it's also another web page, another YouTube link. So just have a look at our networks, and you will find it easily. Thank you all. So I invite who is in the room now to have a break, and who is online and want to join us later also to have a little break. And also warmly thank you, Lee. It's always a pleasure to have you on board in Geneva, physically or online. So thank you all.
Thank you very much.